We spend a lot of this hobby trying to simulate the passage of time. We use pigments to mimic rust and moss, washes to fake grime, and we spend hours and hours meticulously painting tiny plastic toys to make them look like ancient stone. But while Warhammer and Trench Crusade may borrow a lot from the Gothic masterworks of old, there is no substitution for the real thing. I want to create a gaming board, a modular graveyard for games like Nekropolis, Rot and Forbidden Psalm, and to get inspired, I came here, to learn from the dead. Today we are at the graveyard in Stahnsdorf, which is the second largest graveyard in all of Germany. To be honest with you, I'm not entirely sure why we're here. I think I just felt a pull to go to this place and have a look at it for myself. I'm kind of obsessed with graveyards and with memorials. Behind me you can see the church here. We went inside, it's incredible. It's built entirely out of wood. It's really, really pretty. And the artistry and craftsmanship that goes into a building like that is just mind-blowing to me. And I like going to places like this because in our modern world there's a lot of streamlining of processes and architecture, especially where all of the detail gets left out because it's inefficient, right? It's not cost efficient and it doesn't serve a practical purpose. I understand the argument for leaving out the details like that, and I do advocate for spending our collective resources on maybe more important things like social projects. But that said, going to a place like this where someone has spent thousands of hours going over every little detail, I think that is what draws me to that. In our hobby, we like to obsess over the little details and we like to make sure that every little thing looks perfect. We spend a lot of time looking at tiny little things, right? And I think that is part of what fascinates me about graveyards and mausoleums and gravestones and churches, is the attention of detail that someone has spent working on something that is essentially for the dead and the grieving, which I think is such a human and beautiful thing, spending so much time on something that is inherently sad. And so I thought a lot about how to do this respectfully. I want to be respectful to the people grieving their loved ones here, to the people visiting the graveyard and maintaining the graveyard. But I thought it would be interesting to go around, look at some of the older buildings in this graveyard and at some of the mausoleums and see the craftsmanship that went into those and see what we can maybe learn for our hobby. Because I want to build a graveyard board for Nekropolis. There's a lot of games where you play on graveyards essentially, right? And the hobby is full of undead and gothic horror and dead stuff. And so going to a place where actual dead people are and where the architecture is actually built for that purpose and seeing how that works in real life, I think can inform the hobby and also help to ground us, right? And see a little bit of the reality of that. So yeah, if you'd like, come along and we'll take a look at some historic gravesites in the second largest graveyard in all of Germany. There's a lot of graves here, like those ones there, that are kind of run down and maybe forgotten or not as tended to. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe money ran out or they moved away to a different city and there's no one left to care for the graves, right? And so one tradition that I think is really nice and maybe you could consider doing as well is every year on Halloween, starting last year, I like to go to a graveyard and we find one of these graves where maybe the name is kind of washed out, you can't really see who it is anymore, or like it's very overgrown or kind of in a forgotten place of the cemetery. And we like to kind of try to make out the name and say the name and have like a little moment where you honor the person that is maybe forgotten. And I think that's a nice way of sort of honoring the dead on Halloween in a way that to me feels respectful, because there's nobody left to remember these people in a lot of cases. And I like to think that when I'm in the dirt someday, some young people spending like a spooky night in the cemetery and finding my old forgotten grave and saying my name out loud, that would bring me joy. My first experience with human death was a man named Otto Herbert Hayek. My grandmother used to work for him. He was an artist. And as kids, me and my brother, we used to play in his house and in his workshop. And he was pretty dear to me. He was very involved with the church, and he designed a lot of art and sculptures for churches. And so inherently, he was always involved with sort of these grand gestures of artistry. I remember me and my grandmother doing something in his garden after he passed away. And that was the first time that I really felt grief. And years later, when my grandfather died, it was very special. All of us, our whole family, we were all there when he passed away, and we all got to say goodbye. And we stood around his bed. And after he died, I got to say goodbye one last time. My grandfather is now buried in a forest graveyard, much like this one, in the south of Germany, right across from that artist. And when I visit my grandmother, it's always nice to be able to visit both of them in that graveyard. This behind me, these things are crazy. This the level of the money and the status that you needed to have something like this built for your family. We looked at some of the modern graves right now, and they're mostly just stones. My grandfather's grave is just a stone in the ground, like on the ground, with his name on it. And I think that's perfectly sufficient, right? It's just a place that tells you this is the official place to think about this person, right? In my opinion, you don't even need to really bury the dead in order to have a grave. The motivations behind something like this are vastly different. And while we're walking past this, it's very hard for me not to just marvel at all of the fine work that has gone into each and every one of these. All of the sculptures, all of the statues, all of the little details. And they all tell a story about what was important to the people that are buried there, what was important to the people that buried them, and what was important to the culture at the time. There's a lot of religious iconography, obviously. This is an evangelical graveyard. This is, by the way, the largest evangelical graveyard in Germany. So second largest overall, largest evangelical one. And obviously you have a lot of crosses, a lot of angels, a lot of cherubs, a lot of Virgin Marys, a lot of Jesus. As someone who's not Christian myself, it's always kind of a strange feeling being surrounded by so much religious iconography, and especially the Christian cross kind of being synonymous with gravesites. There's just not an institutionalized sort of way for people who are not in a community of faith to have that same sort of officialized place of mourning. I mean, obviously you can have a grave and a gravesite even if you're not Christian, but it is this whole wealth, this whole world of iconography is sort of not yours to access. Even more beautiful when you see stuff like this where there's sort of more naturalist imagery as well, less of a gravestone and more of like just a site of remembrance, which I think is really beautiful. A lot of the games we play kind of focus around cemeteries and the dead and graveyards and all of that. And there's a lot of undead, skeletons, zombies, vampires. I'm a big fan of those. I love those. You might be able to tell by what I wear, by the way I dress. And so I want to build some boards for playing D&D and Mordheim and Rot and Nekropolis. They're all played on like 40 by 40 centimeter, 16 by 16 inch, I think, boards. I've got like a bunch of Warhammer graveyard terrain, like plastic kits, and I want to build a little graveyard board. So part of what I'm doing here today is I want to look at some of these old gravestones and see like how were they built, which motifs are sort of there, how can we represent those, and how can we maybe replicate some of that. And of course the older gravestones are better for that, since they're sort of more representative of that era. And there are some gravestones here which are really old. It's not just interesting to see how were the stones sculpted, how were they laid out, but also how does time affect a graveyard, right? How does stuff get sort of grown over? How does the weathering work? How do they get weathered? Stuff like that. So that is sort of a bit of what I'm interested in here. And I think after we're done here, I want to go back home and cast some of the gravestone bits that I have out of resin. And so this is a bit of a research field trip as well. For a lot of people, graveyards are sort of sad and grimy and dark and dingy places. But I think cemeteries, while they can be sad, are really beautiful places. I mean, this is where people come to remember their loved ones. To me, they're sort of a monument to like the human condition and our inherent need to love each other and to keep loving each other even after we're dead. And that's really, really beautiful. Even though graveyards are always like sort of emotionally heavy places and they need to be respected, I do really enjoy coming to them, right? They're public places. It's sort of like a park, but just a park with a lot of dead people in it. That was a very large graveyard for sure. It's definitely inspiring for building a board and doing a little project. I think all of the Gothic architecture is definitely what resonates with me the most. And I wish we would have seen some more like proper mausoleums. I know there are some there. It's just the graveyard is so large that it was hard to find them. We did have a look in the end at some of the plaques there. And there's like a map of some of the famous people that are buried in that cemetery. And there were definitely some names there that we recognized and some very notable figures. One of them, Phil, you said was like an oracle that prophesized the Reichstag burning down, right? Is that what you said? Yeah. That is crazy. And they were murdered by the Nazis. So there's like some very interesting people. The original director of Dracula is in that cemetery. I would have loved to see that grave, so maybe we go back for that at some point.
Das war Nosferatu.
Ah,
Von der Film.
Nosferatu, of course. The original director of Nosferatu is in that graveyard as well. But you know, a lot of the names on that plaque I didn't recognize, and that could just be me being young and ignorant. But I think it's also sort of time just moves along, and then you get forgotten. At a certain point, you're forgotten, right? Even doesn't matter how famous you are, you will die and you will be forgotten. Graveyards are like the memento mori, right? You will die and you will end up in a grave or in an urn somewhere at some point. And so I think it's also sort of like it makes you appreciate being alive a little, maybe going to a graveyard, right? Does that make sense? You guys agree or not?
Yes, sure.
So full of inspiration, and I think it was a great trip, and I'm excited to start building some graveyard stuff myself when I'm back home. So thanks for coming along, and I'll see you back at the work desk. So this is step 1 in my Nekropolis graveyard board. And I got my mom to help me out because she's got a lot of experience with casting and resins. So I selected some bits that I wanted to cast out of my collection, and Phil also gave me some of his gravestones from Necroplanet Grope. I've made a video about that game. You can check it out here. And so my mom had this awesome silicone that is kind of like a putty. And we decided to try that. And then we also used this Troll Factory silicone. This is like the regular 2-part liquid stuff, but this stuff is like 12 years old, and so we weren't sure if this was gonna work. But I also had a fresh batch in case it didn't. This is something my little brother made like years and years and years ago. And so when we demolded this little silicone mold we made with this putty stuff, I was really surprised to see how well this had worked. All of the detail is in there, and this was so easy because the gravestones are flat on the backside. It's super easy to just kind of glob it all on there. And then we tried some different stuff to pour in there. We started with some UV resin just because it's quick and easy results. And tried to get rid of the bubbles and put that in the little nail polish UV curing machine. And those actually came out alright. They're a little warped and they've got some sort of funky artifacting going on, but I actually like how this turned out. It looks like sort of cursed and evil. And for these standing gravestones, we're gonna pour the Troll Factory resin. Here you can see we also tried some Fimo actually, and they're looking pretty good. To our surprise, the 12-year-old Troll Factory silicone actually seemed to work alright. Like it actually did produce a mold. I haven't actually poured anything in there yet, but I think it's gonna be pretty good. And after a coat of primer, these all look pretty amazing. I really like the artifacting on those broken ones. I took home half of the mold to try out some milliput at home. That's gonna be the next step. And then maybe let me know in the comments if you've got an idea for what material would be best to cast a load of gravestones. Like I want hundreds of them for a big board. Maybe like plaster? Would that be too brittle? You let me know. I don't have any experience with this stuff, but I'm loving how these gravestones are looking right now. So we're making more molds, and there's gonna be a part 2. Until then, take care.